Good morning. If I could have your attention here. Welcome to announcement of the report titled Transnational Organized Crime in Southeast Asia, Evolution, Growth and Impact. So we'll start by remarks from the speakers at the front. And then our regional representative, Jeremy Douglas, will present the report details, and food and refreshments will be served afterwards. If you would like a copy of the report, they are at the registration table at the front. So if we could start by remarks by Senator Air Chief Marshal Prajin Junthong, please.
Thank you very much. Ambassador of Australia, Allan McKinnon, Chargé the Affairs of the United States, Peter Haymond, Unodc Regional Representative Jeremy Douglas, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, Sawasdee krap. I am pleased to be speaking at the announcement of the new Unodc report, Transnational Organized Crime Threat Assessment for Southeast Asia, Evolution, Growth and Impact. We work closely with Unodc and particularly Jeremy and his team in Bangkok to ensure we capitalize on the opportunity for Thailand to engage in the Global Commission on Narcotic Drugs and the Global Commission on Crime Preventive and Criminal Justice, as well as coordinating on the plans of the Mekong MOU on drug control and ASEAN. It is important to note that this year we are also closely working with Unodc to advance border management as a key solution to transnational crime in ASEAN, and in particular to promote broader liaison office, which we have and believe strongly in, because they yield practical results as well as related work on cross-border cooperation and operations are priorities like precursor control. In all cases, it helps Thailand and the region to work with the Unodc, given the political neutrality and impartiality of the UN, but also because practically we need countries of the region to work together and for the region to work with the surrounding Asia Pacific on solutions. It is clear that when we consider solutions to transnational organized crime, we need to engage all necessary partners on sensitive issues, even when it is difficult to do so, and we need to coordinate beyond normal efforts. Fundamentally, we also need to ensure that the plans that we work on together in the Mekong and ASEAN are built on information and data, and that they are strategic plans developed without considering the situation as we can understand it, and without appreciating the challenges to come. We are not likely to be successful. This is why reports of this nature matter to us, and why we will consider the finding at the highest level of the government of Thailand. Importantly, Thailand and other ASEAN governments, as well as international partners from within the region and beyond, participated in the development of this report, sharing data and case information, and it is a reflection of a collective effort. Even as the finding will be challenging for the region to consider, we have also noticed that support of Australia and the United States to the report and to sharing information throughout the development process, and the key role of both countries as ASEAN dialogue partners to this effort and to related solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, the findings of the report are a call to action for Thailand and the region Those of us that have been working on solutions, is particular to the region's drug situation, have watched with great concern as organized crime have expanded synthetic drugs production and trafficking to levels never seen before, and how use, especially by young people, is impacting the region. Methamphetamine is the number one transnational crime concern of governments across the region, and as drug use levels have expanded, the profits of the organized crime involved have crossed to alarm levels. We must address this situation urgently in the ASEAN and Mekong regions, or we will suffer social and community impacts for years to come. There are other concerns noted in the report for Thailand and the region as well. We will worry about the impact of the illegal timber and wildlife trades on the environment, the availability of counterfeit products, and the trafficking of people. Thailand is making concerted effort to address all these challenges and will emphasize shared regional and multilateral solutions as a practical way forward. As we look to the future, we need to consider how we react to the finding of this important report, and in particular, we need to do so strategically. We will discuss and consider in advance of coming ASEAN meeting on transnational crime and the Mekong MOU meeting, and consider solutions we can agree with regional partners and UNODC as well key international partners. Importantly, we will continue to advance ASEAN Border Management Plan this year and in the future. At the same time, we will work with UNODC and partners to look for ways to engage policy leaders from across the region and wider Asia Pacific to counter the influence of organized crime, especially by addressing the conditions that they exploit. In closing, I would like to thank UNODC and the ambassadors and everyone here today. The partnerships between Thailand, ASEAN, UNODC, and our international dialogue partners goes from strength to strength, and our relationship will become more important as we consider how to collectively address the challenge of transnational organized crime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now, Ambassador of Australia to Thailand, His Excellency Mr. Allan McKinnon, please.
Thank you very much. Senator Prajin, Excellency Mr. Peter Haymond, and UNODC Regional Representative Jeremy Douglas, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honour to be invited here to support the launch of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime report, Transnational Organised Crime in Southeast Asia, Evolution, Growth and Impact 2019. Australia was very pleased to join with the Government of the United States to support the UNODC to develop this new transnational organised crime threat assessment for Southeast Asia. It's a timely piece of work. Over the last few decades, we have witnessed enormous change in the Southeast Asian region. The mass movement of people and goods across borders has opened up new trading opportunities, fueling economic development and a rise in living standards. We're more connected and we're more dependent on each other than ever before. But with new opportunities comes new challenges. We have seen a rise in the number of criminals seeking to exploit new avenues for illicit trade and travel for their own illegal gain. Transnational serious organised crime has now established itself as a major threat to this region's security, stability and prosperity. Transnational crime endures because the criminal elements continuously adapt and evolve to their enterprises to changing circumstances. So we too must adapt and evolve. We must strengthen our cooperative efforts if we are to prevent and address these criminal activities. Our ability to combat transnational crime rests on effective collaboration between government agencies and on our international engagement. In Australia, we recently launched our national strategy to fight transnational serious and organised crime. That strategy emphasises the high priority we place on strengthening cooperation with international partners like Thailand to combat transnational crime. And I would just say, Senator Prajin, as an example of lifting our cooperation from strength to strength, the Australian Federal Police and the Thai Police have been working together now for 40 years with an AFP presence in Bangkok. And tonight we celebrate that with a special function where we'll have so many of our Royal Thai Police friends joining with us. The Unodc's report will be a valuable tool in our efforts to combat international crime. The report highlights some of our common transnational crime challenges, including, for example, the significant increase in methamphetamine trafficking and the vulnerabilities of our region to trafficking in persons. Australia will continue to focus on building regional capacity to counter these threats. At the 2018 ASEAN-Australia Special Summit, we announced ASEAN-Australia Counter-Trafficking, a 10-year, $80 million commitment to continue our long-running collaboration with ASEAN to combat trafficking in persons in our region. We're also pleased to support the Indo-Pacific Justice and Security Program, delivering targeted capacity-building projects in the region to counter money laundering, terrorist financing, people smuggling, and trafficking in persons. Our cooperation with regional law enforcement partners to combat illicit drugs has also brought significant success, including through joint law enforcement task forces with countries in the Southeast Asian region. I'm confident this strong cooperation will continue and grow from strength to strength. I'm also confident that this report will help us to stay alert to the evolving threat of transnational crime by enabling a strong policy dialogue on these issues and providing a sound evidence base to support police and security operations. May I congratulate Jeremy Douglas and his team in the Office for Drugs and Crime for developing this valuable report. I would also like to offer my thanks again to the United States for joining with Australia to fund this excellent initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Lastly, if I could have Charge d'Affaires of the U.S. Embassy, Mr. Peter Haymond, please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. On behalf of the government of the United States of America, very pleased to be speaking this event to lay out UNODC's findings after an 18-month process supported by our governments. I want to thank particularly Senator Air Chief Marshal Prajin Junthong for his leadership on these combating transnational crime issues in past, in his former role as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Justice, and his continued support now as a Senator, and for the long-time partnership of the Thai government in working with the United States government and other partners over the many decades, not unlike the Australians. I want to thank Ambassador McKinnon and the Australian government. We have been proud to partner with them throughout the region and throughout the world to strengthen the rule of law and to promote citizen security in all the countries where we work together. And thanks, of course, to Jeremy and the UNODC team for organizing today's event to highlight the findings, and of course for all their work in putting together the findings to show the evolving patterns of transnational crime and to help foster more dialogue, more robust dialogue on how to cooperate to meet those challenges. As Ambassador McKinnon mentioned, Southeast Asia has been changing rapidly in recent decades. ASEAN is now one of the world's largest and still fastest growing economic communities and trading blocs, and it also serves as a geographic crossroads for the entire region for people of all types, economically and otherwise, legal and otherwise. Countries throughout the region are carrying out major upgrades in air, road, rail, and port infrastructure. They're looking at ways to increase and facilitate cross-border movements of labor, capital, and goods. ASEAN itself is looking to make this trade flow more easily as it integrates more as an economic entity. But as noted, these are great opportunities. These are great things. These are positive things for our society. But these same connections offer opportunities for those who are willing to break the law and trade in illegal goods that harm the same society. Criminal networks are looking to exploit the same infrastructure and procedures that governments are using to facilitate legal trade. In 2013, when UNODC published its first comprehensive report on transnational crime in this region, it estimated the size of the overall illicit economy in the region at approximately $90 billion. That is a sum that has certainly grown since that time, with greater opportunities and with more illicit goods being traded. Transnational crime, organized crime, by definition, crosses national borders, trying to take advantage of differences in laws, procedures, differences or lack of communication between law enforcement authorities on either side of those borders. Left unchecked, transnational organized crime can undermine governments, disrupt markets, drain national assets, inhibit the development of stable societies, and endanger our citizens generally. Transnational crime requires an effective transnational response. And the United States is very pleased to have supported the development of this report by UNODC, because a common understanding of the scale, the scope, and the patterns of the current challenge is essential to effectively working together to address it. We have been proud, as I said, to work very closely with the Kingdom of Thailand for many decades, with Australia as well, with other partners in the region. We will continue that work. We continue that commitment to working with our partners here to make the region as strong and as safe for our citizens as possible. My best wishes for a productive discussion today, and thanks again to UNODC both for organizing and for providing the substance, the meat that will be discussed today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now our UNODC's regional representative, Mr. Jeremy Douglas, will give you some summary of the report itself.
Thank you, Megumi. And I'd like to begin by thanking this very august panel that I'm sitting on. I have the honor of sitting with the Senator, who has been a great partner for the United Nations and for UNODC over the recent years as Deputy Prime Minister, Justice Minister, and now Senator, as really a champion for addressing the challenges which I will now brief you on, as well as to the Ambassador McKinnon and Chargé, Haymond. The United States and Australia have been incredible partners throughout this process, patient partners as we've worked hard for the last year and a half to develop this evidence base, which is really necessary for us to consider the challenges that have been touched upon by the speakers as the region has integrated. And so we're looking now at we are reflecting now on how those challenges need to be addressed. I have the pleasure of telling you about them. Before I get into the meat, if you will, as Mr. Haymond had referred to it, just to give you a background on what this is, how we've come about to produce these types of reports in key regions of the world. The UNODC, reporting through the General Assembly, has been conducting risk assessments and threat assessments in these key regions. And the rationale really being that as globalization has occurred, there's been a dark side to it. There's a need to support key regions to address the vulnerabilities that have arisen from that globalization. And so what we do is we look to quantify those illicit flows, understand them better, and project the threats ahead better. And that allows us really to put in place the evidence base which is necessary for a region like Southeast Asia to move forward. It took a year and a half, and I'd like to thank all of the ASEAN governments, some of whom are here today, China, Korea, Japan, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, for participating. They helped us scope the study. They helped share intelligence and case files and data with us throughout that process. And then this year, we gathered again, where we presented preliminary findings to that exact same group. Very, very much an owned product by this region, and that's the key. We need them to understand and be aware of what we're about to say, but also really own what is said. In this report, we have looked at 8 different kinds of transnational crime, which you can group into 4 different types of crime: drugs, people, environment, goods. We've also very much looked at the enabling factors, the environment, if you will, that organized crime need to do their work, and how those enabling factors are taken advantage of. So we've looked very closely, as has been mentioned by all of the speakers, the drug economy, which is probably the most grave and threatening of the types of transnational crime, as it has an immediate impact on communities. We've also looked at the flows of trafficking of people and smuggling of migrants, the environment, the wildlife and timber trades, which have a sense of urgency to them, which I think a lot of us now appreciate, as we've seen biodiversity under threat from the trafficking of these wildlife and timber products, and also counterfeit goods, which are a very significant issue within this region, counterfeit goods and falsified medicines. I'm going to start first with the trafficking of persons. We have looked at that enabling environment and found that organized crime are really exploiting the differences in the economic development levels of the countries of the region and the demand for cheap labor. Not a surprise, but it is a significant factor within the drive, the push and pull of these flows within particularly the Mekong. And we see the smuggling of migrants from these countries, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, into this country alone, generating up to potentially almost $200 million a year for the traffickers and smugglers. We also see, very unfortunately, the continuing trafficking of people for sexual exploitation. And in that case, we see the proportion of trafficking victims in some of these countries as women being extremely high, particularly here in Thailand, Malaysia, and Myanmar. As many of you would have been looking over the years at the different flows out of Myanmar, the trafficking and smuggling of Rohingya migrants from the Bay of Bengal being the most pronounced, really did drive home the differences between the countries here within the region. We saw mass movement by boat over the Bay of Bengal into and trying to get to Malaysia and Indonesia. And really that emphasized to us that desire to move, and the fact that people within certain conditions within the region don't have the ability, the opportunity that they need to make a good life for themselves, that they look to get out. Unfortunately, we've now since seen that flow shift west towards Bangladesh the last couple of years, where there was a mass movement of people under threat of oppression from forces there. This is something which we don't anticipate slowing because, of course, the conditions within Rakhine State in Myanmar being what they are. And as I touched on at the beginning, the smuggling into this country, to Thailand, remains a significant issue. Really, it is an issue with Myanmar, and one of the drivers for this that you'll find in the report is the fact that it is simply less expensive to use a smuggler than it is to legally migrate for work. This issue has been tried to be addressed by the government. The government of Thailand has actually put in place very positive measures to make it easier for people to migrate for the purposes of work, but still, in some instances, it's really much less expensive for people to migrate illegally. And really, the flows are really about Myanmar. So we do see people moving from Cambodia and Laos illicitly, or illegally, but we really see that pronounced moving in from Myanmar, where again, I touched on earlier, there's much more dire circumstances in some parts of the country. One of the issues that I touched on at the beginning was wildlife and timber trafficking. It's an issue which is starting to get attention, and I commend the ASEAN group of states, and particularly the government of Thailand, for the effort that they've made over the last 3 to 4 years, chairing a task force of ASEAN on wildlife and timber trafficking. But really, there's an urgency to this. Some of the biodiversity of this region is under incredible threat. Forests are being cleared, habitat is being lost. And we're literally, if you look at the numbers from, say, the United Nations Environment Program, maybe a decade away from when there will be extinction of certain species in this region. So we really have to treat it differently than we do some of the other forms of transnational crime, treat it with a sense of urgency, if you will. And some of the most pronounced flows, and this is really about Africa, because this region is a destination and a transit as well, is rhino horn and ivory remain extremely valuable, and they're trafficked. In some cases, rhino horn is more valuable than, say, heroin. So it's being trafficked into this region for the demand or the latent demand, and also for demand in neighboring regions. And unfortunately, we have seen, this is in 2019 data, which is in the report, cases which are in the report, we have seen records set this year. So while last year we saw a bit of a dip the last couple of years in the seizures of ivory and rhino, in this year alone we've seen a surge, as there has really been a push out of Africa, and those supply chains have become globalized. And something which I think really deserves some reflection in the region is the impact of displacement, and I'll touch on that in the drugs briefing as well. But we have seen some countries, if you look on the left, actually experience an increase in forest cover. And that's been experienced because they've put in place logging bans to essentially stop the illegal logging within the illegal harvest and logging within their country. But what that has done is push it into other countries where the sources are now being found. So in a sense, what we're seeing is people shift their business into those other countries, and we've seen Cambodia, Timor, Myanmar, and Indonesia experience the opposite of Vietnam, which has seen an increase in its own forest cover. So this is actually a displacement effect, and something which the region really needs to grapple with, and exactly why what the ambassadors had mentioned, we need to have a transnational solution to the transnational crime. The policy implications of certain actions can be negative in other countries. One of the bigger flows, and it's quite eye-opening when you look at the dollar terms, is counterfeit goods, where we're able to quantify in dollar terms what they're worth. Counterfeit goods in this region are worth almost $36 billion a year, and these range from all kinds of goods, everything from automobile parts through to alcohol and cigarettes, but the biggest being cigarettes. But enormous volumes of money, and also enormous volumes of money when it comes to falsified medicines. And again, very good data sets to draw on to allow us to draw the figure of almost $2.6 billion a year. And there's a wide range of these, but one thing that is really apparent to us, this is European data about the source of their counterfeits, but one of the things that is very, very apparent, European and Japanese data, one of the things that's very apparent is the displacement again into this region. This region used to receive counterfeits, which is still the case, and we see the countries that are producing a lot of them, but now we see the manufacture of these goods within this region. In a sense, it's a business decision. Organized crime that are producing counterfeits have offshored operations into this region where there's industrial capacity, where there's a lack of maybe intellectual property rights protection, and they see opportunity. In a sense, it's a cheaper business center to produce, so they're moving them into these countries. And we see very much now the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, so for example, becoming sources where once they were the destination, which is quite unique. And as I said, illicit tobacco is enormous within this region. Some countries, for example, Malaysia at the far right, the majority of the tobacco sold in that country is actually illicit or counterfeit, which is quite amazing. And that's, in a sense, a result of their taxation scheme having tried to dampen down smoking, and they put in place high taxes, which basically gave an economic incentive to traffickers. But this region is now a source, and we see countries like Australia as very much a destination for illicit tobacco from this region. And within the region, huge volumes being consumed, particularly Indonesia, which leads the consumption, although a smaller amount of the overall total. And then falsified medicines are a huge, significant issue. And our colleagues in WHO are working with us on addressing this through trade security. Really, we see now, as I said, this region emerging as a production point for various illicit goods, counterfeit goods, but also falsified medicines. And this should really matter to everyone here. They are actually they're proliferating across the region and actually causing disease to change. So it's not just a criminal issue and the immediate money being made, but they're causing strains of malaria to adapt. Why? Because they have certain amounts of active ingredients, not enough perhaps. They may be different active ingredients in them, and they're causing the change to take place. And all of these countries, the darker Thailand, and the Philippines are reporting high frequency of fake pharmaceuticals in their market. And I've left the biggest flows for last, which are illicit drugs. And when we think of the power of organized crime, there is nothing like the drug business to illustrate that power as we now see it in this region. When we did the study that Chargé Haymond referred to earlier in 2013, we estimated the methamphetamine economy, if you will, all of the value generated through the methamphetamine trade at roughly $15 billion a year. That's a sizable amount of money. It exceeds the GDP of several countries. What we can now say, and this is a relatively safe conservative estimate, is that it's over $60 billion a year. In just over a 5-year period, it has scaled to that extent. And it's scaled because of the types of facilities that are projected on that screen. That's an industrial scale facility, which means the organized crime groups have really figured out how to produce mass volumes of this drug and traffic. So really this region has become an epicenter, if you will, of this global synthetic drug trade, which is exactly why the Senator touched on in his speech the alarming concern and the social impacts that are resulting. Also, heroin is also a significant issue, although it has subsided. We had at that time estimated it to be worth more than methamphetamine, but it has dropped to roughly $10 billion a year. And this graph really illustrates that change. If you look at the graph on the left, that is methamphetamine on the top and heroin on the bottom. Heroin flatlined and started dropping. And this is the heroin or opium poppy cultivation, on the right, which really shows there's been that subsidence in heroin or opium production and thus heroin production in recent years. But a massive surge in synthetic drugs, which are really flooding this region. And this is the amount the heroin is worth. China being the largest portion of that $10 billion would be roughly just over $6 billion. The rest would be within Southeast Asia and to some extent in Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of East Asia. Really, China remains the world's largest heroin market by sheer volume consumption. All of it is coming out of the Golden Triangle. They're seizing very, very little Afghan heroin, and there's almost no Afghan heroin coming into this region, reflecting again that drop in demand. But the opposite is true when it comes to methamphetamine, and that lab that I showed you a few slides ago really emphasized the scale of production, but this is the result, which is really that ski slope or upward trajectory, year-on-year increases in production. Really, you can see it happen in 2015-16, and you can see the trafficking patterns change. It used to come from many countries. There were labs proliferating around the region, and now what we've seen is really a concentration within a certain part of the Golden Triangle in northern Shan State, where we see that massive production taking place. And this graph really illustrates it well, which shows you the clandestine meth lab drop-off in China is the dark line, and the massive meth supply, which is the lighter line, jumping. So you see a drop in the country that used to be the biggest producer, and then a massive rise in supply. An unarrested supply. It's not slowing. And all the conditions that have allowed that to take place remain in place. So our understanding of the situation is if we look ahead, unless those conditions are dealt with on the ground, the governance issues, it will continue. And for a country like Thailand, this is the reason the Senator is here, but also for a country like Thailand, this is what the implications are. Essentially, 2017 and then last year, this country seized 50% of the methamphetamine produced in a neighboring, in Myanmar, essentially. Unbelievable amounts, over 500 million yaba tablets last year, almost 20 tons of crystal meth, and that volume is flooding the streets. The seizures have not made a difference in price. Street prices here now are where they were 20 years ago. So in a sense, the supply gets lost through these seizures, but it doesn't have an impact on the market itself, which just continues to expand because of the production being so high. In essence, traffickers can lose their supply. It doesn't affect their business model. And this is a good example of that price collapse. That's Malaysian data on prices. In a sense, what's happened is it's now less than a third of what it once was for a kilo of crystal methamphetamine in Malaysia. And that crystal methamphetamine is emanating from the Golden Triangle, essentially cascading out across the region. And it's doing so in these types of packages. And many of you have seen these in the media, these tea packages. It has been talked about for the last couple of years, but increasing media reports of this, all of these countries, Australia, it is going everywhere. And this is one from this week, so I just commend the Royal Thai Police for this, the NSB for this particular seizure, which happened here in Bangkok earlier this week. But that's a very typical case. When I first started in this business in this region 15, 16 years ago, that would have been a 2-year total for Thailand in crystal meth. They just seized yaba. Now they seize this almost on a weekly basis. These piles of crystal methamphetamine, which, as I said, are flooding the streets. And the volume of money being generated, if you look at that high-end estimate that I touched on earlier, that $60 billion, this is where it's being generated. So it's really Southeast Asia is almost half of it. Disproportionately, it's Australia and New Zealand and other parts of like Korea and Japan, where they pay a price that is so high that the incentive is to get it there. Even though their prices are down as well at the wholesale rate, still, imagine that, $60 billion up 4 times in a 5-6 year period. Amazing. One of the things that you'll see in this report, which I think deserves attention of all of you, and this is how that money, that $60 billion, moves. It isn't simply that the money is made and pocketed, it has to move. And you've seen, and thanks to the US government for their good work with their OFAC and so forth, you've seen the King's Roman Casino in Laos get flagged for money laundering problems related to drugs and other forms of transnational crime. But there's been a proliferation of casinos across this region, something which is rarely talked about, deserves attention. We've had 230 essentially come into play on a fairly sizable scale the last few years, most of which are in neighboring Cambodia. But a lot of them emerged after a money laundering crackdown in nearby Macau. And the volumes of money that are generated through those various illicit businesses I have touched on take full advantage of that mechanism, of those casinos, and the fact that they're unregulated and are cash-based. It's that type of thing that deserves attention. That's one of those enabling factors that really deserves some focus from this region. And to address this is not an easy thing. As has been touched upon by this panel, we really need a shared approach to address these challenges, the transnational solutions for the transnational crime. And that really requires a different approach. We have had our task forces, they're working, they're reacting to that situation which I have described. But really we need leadership, like the Senator and others, to really grapple with this, come up with shared plans, and agree that there has to be a better way forward, and not just simply Southeast Asia. Those flows that I have described, particularly on the drug side, but also if you see the environmental crime side, you see interregional flows that are extremely strong. The drugs from here are going elsewhere. The solution has to be broader than simply ASEAN. It has to be ASEAN plus, which means the Asia Pacific. And through that, we can piggyback functional strategies to address the challenge. Really, we also, you'll see in this report, are extremely candid about the data. We have really good data on the drug side. We have extremely robust data sets, particularly in law enforcement. We lack data, which didn't allow us to quantify some of those illicit flows in dollar terms. So we've pulled together what we can to understand the mechanics of the trade, but we can't say how much they're worth because there's an interconnection between legitimate trade and illegitimate trade or lack of data. But we really need that intelligence developed, that information developed, which would allow us to build the evidence for us to respond intelligently to some of these challenges. And as the Senator had said, we're working very closely on border management. Something that is very, very apparent is the cross-border nature of these crimes. You cannot get away from the fact that the flows are interregional, across borders within the region, and that's why Thailand has championed this agenda this year with us and with their dialogue partners, looking at removing or lowering the disparities across borders as states need to cooperate. And so I'd really encourage you to look at the last point, really look at the report's recommendations in each chapter, which tell you what we think at a high level should be happening in relation to those various forms of transnational crime. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to now open the floor for questions. If you could please identify yourself, your name and your organization, would be great. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You ask.
David Schwarzenhuber, and I grew up on the St. Lawrence River. And the St. Lawrence River, the boundary is between the St. Lawrence River. It's right in the middle of the river. Okay. Recently, I had.
Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a mic behind you, if you could.
Recently, I ran into an investment analyst, and one of the first things he said, and he does his work in Thailand, and he said the biggest thing is raising the wages for the people, and they won't turn into drug users or drug whatever. And he's an investment analyst from the United Kingdom, but he spent most of his time here in Thailand. So I throw that to you. Would raising the minimum wage take more people out of the drug business or the methamphetamine?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure?
I'm not sure that would exactly be the result. I would say that if you were to raise wage rates, you would probably have less illicit movement of people because they wouldn't seek economic opportunity elsewhere, or they wouldn't get caught in situations where they are vulnerable economically. In relation to drug use and wage rates, I can't really think or wouldn't really think that would make a significant difference here. What we're seeing now is an engineered build of demand in this region, in fact. So the groups that are producing all that methamphetamine that I've described, I've literally flooded the region for the purpose of building demand. That's what it appears. So they're really pumping it out and making it accessible at any price point. So it's now extremely available. So you can buy it in Bangkok for about $2 a pill. That's amazing. It used to be $6, $7. So it's now at that level, which means you don't need to make money to buy drugs. It's almost the price of a quart of milk. So it's really accessible.
Jeremy, could I just add one small fact? I saw the other day a report which said that Australia now had the highest minimum wages globally. And there's no shortage of people obviously involved in the methamphetamine trade in Australia. So I also worry about that close causal link.
I'm Marwan Mark of the Nikkei Asian Review. Your report highlights China's contribution in curbing the supply routes. Their labs have been shut down. But you never explained why or what was the motivation for the Chinese to do so. And has that disrupted demand for methamphetamines in China?
Actually, yeah, the Chinese did effectively dampen the production of methamphetamine within China 4 or 5 years ago, and they very successfully went after the production in South China. It did not dampen the supply within the country. It essentially now is being trafficked into the country. So it's moved across the border, the production, and the production is now being trafficked back in. So it's had little effect on the Chinese market, to be honest. The reason they went after that was because they were very much, as our Australian colleagues would be well aware, the point from which the production was taking place for the region. They were the big producer 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, but was that for economic reasons? Was that for prestige? I mean, what was the motivation for the Chinese to take this position?
Well, the supply kept surging from China. Going back a decade, it kept rising year on year, and there was a lot of concern about the methamphetamine supply coming out of China, and so they entered into cooperative operations with our colleagues from Australia and other countries to address the trafficking. but then they went after the production and the organized crime themselves. But essentially what that did was displace them to other parts of the region.
Good morning, Jeremy. Thank you for a thorough presentation. My name is Banu. I'm with Save the Children, particularly interested in the human trafficking side of the report. And
Yes.
I saw, obviously we know women and girls are affected disproportionately, but I just wondered, and apologies if this is in the report, whether we actually know how many girls, as opposed to women and girls, or even boys for that matter, like do we have up-to-date data on the number of children being trafficked?
We have general data for some subsets of the region, but to be frank, we do not. The data remain extremely poor when it comes to trafficking in persons. So we have some studies on the Mekong subregion, flows into Thailand, which give you a sense of the scale of that flow that you're describing into this country, but we do not have it for the region as a whole. And that's simply because the governments of the region haven't developed the systems to gather that data and report that data fully.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up then.
Yep.
So how are you able to then calculate the women and girls? Clearly there must be some numbers on girls.
There are, but they're for subsets of the region, not for the region as a whole. So you'll see, for example, what I said about Malaysia. We have some good data from Malaysia. We have some good data on flows here, but we don't have it for some of the countries outside, unfortunately.
Right, so something to
Yeah.
focus on. In
So we've really limited. That's why we didn't project a value amount for the trafficking in persons, because the data remains too shallow to work with. Thank you.
Hi. About the methamphetamine traffic, sorry, Carol Dizot for French newspaper Libération. About the methamphetamine, I mean, obviously is the law enforcement approach working? I mean, at the time of opium, there were some alternative offered, like alternative growth, or is there any program like this that is thought about? Is there alternative solution? I mean, where we are with the law enforcement approach, is that working? That's my first question. About casino money laundering across the region. I mean, that's the elephant in the room, I guess, but how do you engage Chinese leaders on these questions?
To the first question, there's no incentive really that you can give organized crime to move out of the synthetic drug trade. The groups that produce all those volumes of drugs that I referred to are really actually quite tight-knit. There's no supply chain where you need a workforce like you do with other things. So you can't offer an incentive like we do in the opium business to farmers to move them from production. So the challenge we're facing with methamphetamine is that we have to really approach it from addressing the organized crime. The drug law enforcement approach of the region, and I think this is generally acknowledged now by leaders in the region, has been a bit disjointed. It has really focused at lower levels, often mass arrests, but the organized crime have gotten a bit of a pass. They haven't been the focus of law enforcement. We're advising that really be the focus. There's people there making billions of dollars, and they need to be the focus of the law enforcement. There is some of that going on. I commend Thailand, China, Australia, United States, and others for cooperating to build cases against them, but they're not quite there yet. But they're getting there. But the issue also needs to be addressed from a demand perspective. That supply is being consumed, and that there's a lack of balance in the region when it comes to drug policy. We really need to address the growth of the market. And there has been a heavy investment in law enforcement. There has not been a corresponding investment in demand, in prevention, treatment, harm. And that's where we need some heavy focus. And unfortunately, it's not quite there yet. We're advocating heavily for that, as you can tell. And I think that's something which the region really should consider. Otherwise, we can react. You can take out large syndicates, but demand once built is demand. And these products are addictive. Demand does not simply vanish. So a really heavy rebalancing of the drug policy is necessary. To the second point, if you could restate it.
About the casino issues, money laundering, and Chinese leaders.
Yes. Yeah, we're working closely with them. In fact, Thailand is this year hosting a ministerial meeting with China, Thailand, and the other Mekong countries, where this issue, the illicit financial flows associated with the drug trade, will be discussed. This is minister level, led by the Minister of Justice here and the various the counterparts in the other countries. that will be tabled and solutions should hopefully be discussed. So we discuss it at the highest levels. It is very much a new issue. It hadn't been discussed for years, and suddenly it has emerged as an issue. So, but it requires some urgent attention, as you can tell, because that money is moving through them. So we're really trying to raise awareness first and get on the table that there's some urgency to this. If that mechanism isn't taken away, the money laundering will continue through those cash-based businesses. Thank you.
Johnny, can you tell something about the alternative development of the illicit?
Sure. Yeah, actually, the Senator has just raised a good point. We actually working very closely with Thailand on resilience of communities, particularly in the north now, with Her Highness Bajrakati Yaba Mahedon, who's our Goodwill Ambassador. We've, under the leadership of the Senator when he was Deputy Prime Minister, announced an initiative in the north where working with key districts that are vulnerable to trafficking of methamphetamine and other drugs, dealing with the community response and the gathering of information from the communities themselves to respond, building, in a sense, their resilience to traffickers, which are taking advantage of those border communities, really in the north in Chiang Rai, Chiang Mai, and that part of the country. And it's at the early stages, but showing very good signs of success now. So we're really proud that she is doing this as a Goodwill Ambassador of ours, but also as Her Highness on behalf of the government of Thailand.
Mr. Douglas, Senator Prajin. My name is Imtiaz Muqbil. I cover the travel and tourism industry. You mentioned the advantages of globalization and openness and integration. And the travel and tourism industry in this part of the world is one of the primary leading beneficiaries of this openness. But from everything you mentioned, casinos, wildlife trafficking, counterfeit goods, prostitution, there seems to be a downside impact of this openness and free flows of people. I was just wondering if you have any analysis of how much tourism, free flows of tourism between the peoples of this region is actually contributing, making all these problems worse, and whether you see some check and balance mechanisms within the travel and tourism industry in terms of either visa restrictions or something that will abate this problem. So what is the contribution of travel and tourism, on the one hand, beneficiary as well as on the downside? And perhaps do you think that maybe some curbs on this openness might actually lend itself towards alleviating some of these problems that you're talking about? And particularly, Senator Prajin, I'd like to get your comments on this as well, because Thailand is right at the hub of all this infrastructure, and as a policy matter seems to be positioning itself as a geographical, economic, social, cultural crossroads, a hub of all these activities. Do you think that policy needs to be amended, curbed a little bit, adapted in view of the downsides as well? Thank you.
Actually, you've touched on a very key issue, which Chargé Haymond mentioned in his opening remarks, which was this, the growth of the market within this region and the incredible growth that continues to this day for the ASEAN trade bloc. But as this agenda has moved forward and has actually been facilitated by various initiatives, ASEAN Single Window, the different infrastructure initiatives that are supported by development banks, there has not been a similar investment, political yet or financially, in the addressing the security aspects and the potential downsides of that. What we're doing through reports like this is advocating there needs to be an alliance of those two agendas, a much more closely joined up approach, so that there can be a security lens applied to the trade agenda. In essence, that's what Thailand is now doing with their border management initiative as the ASEAN chair this year, looking at how to improve border management to secure the ASEAN region and its trade agenda and its prosperity agenda. As you've said, there's been an acceleration of cross-border movement through tourism, but the same is true, as you can see from the slides, through the shipping container trade, through cross-border movements at land borders. Essentially, they're growing year on year. The systems to protect those points of border crossing are not yet in place in all countries, or they're very different country to country. So literally, the Thai leadership on this is crucial. Trying to bring out some standard approaches to the region so that there's less disparity, less difference, and therefore less opportunity for organized crime to take advantage. That's, in a sense, what we're doing together on this. Otherwise, this potential problem, or this problem will potentially continue to grow and be exacerbated by accelerated cross-border movements, which appear to be continuing into the future.
Okay. I'm Pravit from Council of English. I have a question to both of the panelists. Is there any particular reason why both the production and consumption of methamphetamine is amongst the highest in the world here in Southeast Asia? And I mean, if you look at Thailand, I mean, one could think that people consumed drugs such as meth because they're not happy about society or alienated by society. But if you look at other stats like the gross national happiness, Thailand is supposed to be scoring quite high, I mean, globally. So why do they need to rely on meth, or they're just high on meth, that's why they're happy? Thank you.
Good question. Well, in fact, each drug market is different. So yes, why is there more methamphetamine here than other regions? First of all, it's been a very, as I mentioned earlier, very clearly engineered build of demand. So organized crime groups have seen vulnerability and a potential demand, and this region has a very large youth population and rising incomes, very attractive to them to traffic inside the region as well as outside the region to places like Australia, Japan. But they've really pushed the product out, intentionally lowering the price to push it out on the streets and build that market. As I said, though, there's differences between drug markets. If you look at South America, it's a cocaine market. They don't have the same levels of use of methamphetamine. North America has more of a mixed market. This is now a synthetic drug stimulant market, as we've seen the drop in the heroin and we've seen the surge of the methamphetamine. So it's really, that's the drug of choice here, but it's also, it's the available drug. Cocaine is not available here, a little bit, but not really. So it's more a matter of the fact that the organized crime have engineered this, and they've had the opportunity because they don't have competitors. So, as to the gross national happiness, I don't think that it's related to drug use, but and the fact that everyone is happy on drugs. I find that a little bit of a stretch, but interesting. Yeah. One final question.
Yes.
The senator has to leave.
Okay. Jane from Xinhua News Agency. Just according to the presentation that you've shown on screen just now, since history, right, we all know that, you know, a lot of the production of drugs and all has been produced in Myanmar from the ethnic minorities, for example, the Wa group and all that, and then transiting through Thailand. Now, the biggest market seems to be like China. It's always been like that, and then coming to Australia and New Zealand. Are countries like these sort of concerned, especially when the drug substance are getting cheaper? You know, Jeremy has mentioned, like you said, 10, 20 years ago, the price of the amount before then is the same as now, and it's prevalent now as well. So are they concerned? What are some of the measures that they've taken, and, you know, to combat this drug trafficking sort of?
Well, I'm very pleased with what we see Thailand doing, which is really they're leading. As I said, they're about to host a ministerial meeting of the Mekong Group to look at the solutions that the group will need to put in place. Because it's a transnational challenge, they really need to work together on that. The ASEAN Group is talking about it, not as effectively, because they don't get down to the detail of plans, shared plans yet. But really there has been, you're right, the production often traces itself back to these places, these ungoverned or places with governance problems, ungoverned places or places with governance problems. And that is really an underlying condition that needs to be addressed. The fact is that the conditions on the ground really favor production to take place. There's no policing response that is really possible in those locations. So we have to talk with the government of Myanmar and others. Government of Myanmar, because they're the territorial, sovereign territory holder, but we also have to talk to the countries like China, that are the source of the precursor chemicals, or to Thailand, which may be the market. So you need that joined up approach addressing all the different contributing factors which allow the organized crime to perpetuate and build. I would point out, though, I keep mentioning organized crime and not the ethnic armed groups. Yes, they are involved because they control territory, but this is a transnational organized crime problem. the groups behind the production that I discussed have multiple nationalities involved. This is not a matter of the ethnic armed groups producing the teabag meth. This is big international organized crime which are working in territory in North Shan. These are not the old ethnic armed group photos that you used to see with the Yaba packages. It's a very different business now. So we have to think differently, and we really have to think broader, Asia Pacific, for a solution.
No, my question is, what are the feedbacks and from Chinese government, Australian, New Zealand? Are there any substantial sort of measures that they will be implementing that we know of, that they're working on?
Yeah, they're doing joint operations against some of these groups. Australia and China have a joint operational plan in place now for 5 or 6 years. But at the same time, the production has expanded. So that is really, in a sense, chasing the challenge, but it's not necessarily arresting the underlying conditions. It's not addressing the underlying conditions which are allowing the organized crime to produce. So there are plans in place. There are very good initiatives underway, but we require a higher order strategy, which is going to involve leadership of the region at a different level. That's what we would prioritize. As you've noticed in the global discussion on security challenges, terrorism was discussed for many, many years as a priority, and countries of the world have really rallied around terrorism as an issue that needed a collective global response. That is not there yet with organized crime. It needs to get there soon, or some of these things will continue to exacerbate. The challenge will continue to grow. Thank you.
Hi,
Final
sorry,
question.
just one final question. Yeah, hi. Good afternoon. May Wong from Channel News Asia, Singapore television station. My question is really to Senator Prajin. I would like to find out exactly what do you mean by Thailand taking on this leadership role? Exactly how do you intend to do that? And also, I mean, the report has also clearly stated that the prosecution as well as arrests for all these illicit businesses, they have not really kept up with the trend and the speed of which these businesses are profiting. And Thailand clearly is also guilty of that. How do you think Thailand, in that sense, can really show that leadership role? My second question really is about corruption as well. Across all the different illicit businesses, from wildlife to timber to illegal human trafficking, corruption seems to be a major root cause. So can you tell us how exactly do you foresee this can be addressed? Thank you.
Do you want to take on me? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Before I answer the last question, I'd like to explain a little bit about the geography of Thailand. The gentleman just mentioned that, yes, Thailand, like a hub of ASEAN, like a hub of Southeast Asia. So we welcome everyone come to Thailand. However, we have some positive and negative. Something that we not allow coming to the country, something try to come into the country. So when we talk about the trafficking, as Jeremy mentioned, the people, the drugs, the good and the wildlife and timber, it seems like Thailand become a hub of those things. But all of them, we raise all the problem as the national agenda. If you see the rating by the global or standard nation, we can clear almost everything, especially the human trafficking, the drug and the wildlife or timber. When we mention on the drugs, everyone understands that the Golden Triangle covered by 3 countries, Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos. But the precursor, Jeremy just mentioned on the slide, that come from northeast of Golden Triangle and some northwest of Golden Triangle. The problem still how to control the producing a drug in the Golden Triangle. So we need at least three countries to work together, Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. Just a few months ago, we just have the joint operation between three countries, Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. It's come out, it's on the process, it's in the process of implementation. And we already talked to the Chinese representative how to join the joint operation plan between three countries under Mekong MOU. And Chinese already sent the draft to us to make sure that Chinese will support to get rid of the producing in Golden Triangle. So when the answer come to why amphetamine or yaba attack young people, especially in Thailand and in the region, someone mentioned that the price a little bit low. Yes, 5 years ago, the yaba or amphetamine, the price about 200 baht. But right now, you can buy 60 to 100 baht. That means the difference between the drugs and the amphetamine. And the number that our security team can find out and search that is not more than 100 million drugs, amphetamine, in 5 years ago. But right now, it's become 500 millions. This means in the Golden Triangle, they have capability to produce by the new machine, by the new technique, and they try to provide around the Golden Triangle to Thailand, to Myanmar, to Laos, and to Vietnam, and also across to the Cambodia. You can see that on the west side, they are Andaman Sea. Very difficult to control the drugs routes. And on the east side, if the drugs can come through Vietnam, can go to South Pacific, South China Pacific, can go to everywhere. And also if the drug can go through Thailand, can go to the Malaysia, to Singapore, to another country. This become what we need every country to support. Not only the 5 countries plus China in Mekong MOU, but we need ASEAN country. We need outside ASEAN country to support. The question about the US and Australia, any plan or not? Yes, we do have the multilateral plan, especially Thailand and Australia, and 5 countries in Mekong sub-region with Australia and United States. So we work together and we try to cooperate another country via the Unodc. For example, country in Chile or in Europe. So I like to say that the human trafficking, the drug trafficking, and also the wildlife and timber become the first priority that the government will take action. We try to do our best by the new laws, by the new implementation, and we try to support every minute to protect our children in Thailand and our children in ASEAN also. We will work together and closely to UNODC right now to the future to make sure that we try to control the demand and supply as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for gathering here today. Again, please don't forget to pick up a copy of the report, and please feel free to help yourself with the food.